You know, there's this new iPhone 15 that came out a couple weeks ago and everyone's raving about the camera. But what do you think would happen if we actually put a professional cinema camera up against iPhone 15 using cinema mode? Is there even any comparison at all? Would the results be impressive? Is there even a space for smartphones in cinematography, or is it just too early? Well, before we get to that, I remembered when I found myself nearing the completion of numerous feature films, the directors I work for taught me something really interesting. They said, when you make a movie, you actually make 3 movies. The first movie is the one you visualized. This is where you dream, brainstorm, sketch, make storyboards, and write it all on paper. The second movie is the one you shoot. This is where light and lens collide to capture all those special moments as your actors turn mere words into real feelings. And the third movie you make is the one you edit. This is where all the things that didn't work in the script or on set have to be repaired, resolved, or sometimes redone. The challenge for every artist, regardless of your medium, is how far apart these 3 categories are. An obvious objective of creating anything is to capture the totality of the original vision in the final result. But in order to do that, it typically takes time and money and control. And when you have unlimited resources, which is true for some people, the difference between what you visualized, what you shot, and what you edited may be perfectly aligned. But when you work within the normal limitations of time, money, and resources, these 3 versions of the project have a way of drifting further and further apart from each other. And that often means the end result requires you to make compromises. And while we wish we didn't have to do that, dealing with the gap between what you visualize, what you shoot, and what you edit is a reality. But what if? What if technology could close that gap? It probably can't eliminate it, but what if AI could at least shrink it? Our goal in building Strada is to leverage AI to bring the vision of an artist closer to the final cut in less time with more control. But there's a long way to go before we're doing that on a regular basis. And there's one issue that actually came up this week that stumped me, and it's not about tech, it's about taste. If you've been experimenting with generative AI tools like DALL-E, Firefly, and Midjourney, you probably noticed that you can get great AI images, but AI has this look about it. I can't put my finger on it, but you may know what I'm referring to. You might say, well, if it looks good, what does it matter? The reason it matters is because when we create, we should create what we want, not what AI wants. In other words, while AI may be good at interpreting your direct command, it's not good at interpreting your unique taste. When an adult goes to a movie theater and decides to buy a soft drink, they're given an empty cup, they walk over to the soda fountain, they pick a flavor, and fill it up. But have you ever seen what happens when a kid is given that empty cup? They are holding so much power in that moment, they are compelled to invent a drink by mixing every possible flavor together, not caring that it will taste terrible because the opportunity to experiment is actually the better flavor. This behavior is common when we're young, but some of us grow up and continue to see the world as a playground in which to experiment. Trendsetters remain unafraid to try new flavors, initially not concerned whether or not they'll like it. And when we find something we do like, we then want to further tune it to be even more exact to our vision. Artists have strong opinions on everything. That's nothing to apologize for. And when we're shepherding a project, we want what's in our mind to infect every corner of it and experiment with every combination to better orient the results with our original vision. So the question is that a job for a person or a product? In episode 9, I mentioned I'm shooting on the Panavision DXL2 camera using the Panaspeed lenses, which is an entire series of T1.4 lenses that cover the Red Monstro large format sensor. Well, why does this matter? It matters because when it comes to creative control, the best artists regularly want to create images that have a signature look. Some artists are so good at it, you can identify who's behind a film or a photo purely based on how it looks. Following that logic, one of my problems with digital cameras has always been that they try to replicate colors exactly as they exist in nature, right out of the box. But if you think back to the film days, Kodak and Fuji and even Polaroid built different film stocks that created intentionally different styles, all in camera. So when I work with Red and Panavision and LightIron to build the DXL, we built a look that intentionally does not replicate colors as they exist in nature, and instead created a look that was cinematic and stylized right out of the box. And what you're seeing here is that unique look. But if we want to create an even more unique look, we have to take even more control of the entire imaging chain. And we can really achieve something unique not with digital tools, but with analog ones. In the optics world, this is where lenses can create incredible, unique, and beautiful variations. It's why professionals go through painstaking lens tests to find the perfect optical look to fit the project. So let's break down what's happening in one of my lens tests I did several years ago. We'll start with the Panaspeeds, and we can instantly see how clear this lens is. It has built-in contrast with controlled halation that glow around the car headlights. Notice as the out-of-focus bokeh moves towards the edges, the spheres morph from circles to cat-eye shapes. You can also see how the flares are both asymmetrical and multicolored. And take note of the overall saturation that the Panaspeed produces. Now we'll switch to the H Series. Immediately, this lens has less saturation and is far softer. H Series has much stronger halation around the highlights. Remember, this is the same shot, same lighting, same camera, same focal length, same color. So the only difference is that we swapped out the lens, which gives totally different sensations of period. And I would say H Series automatically delivers beauty in the style of vintage portraits, fantasy, or dreams. Next, we look at the Primo Artiste, which lies somewhere in the middle. The flares are much more controlled. Magenta pupil flares subtly warm the image, which makes it appear warmer than the other lenses. It shifts the hue, but remains limited in saturation, which I like. It has a little bit more built-in style, so it falls perfectly between the Panaspeed and the H Series. And then the Ultra Vista. This lens is an ultra widescreen anamorphic lens that has signature flares that bleed beyond the X into the Y axis, making it extremely stylized. This lens changes the entire mood, and remember, it isn't cropped. The aspherical glass inside is built for a 2.76:1 native aspect ratio. I think this anamorphic is the perfect blend of modern and vintage with the perfect balance between halation and contrast. Now, once we put them all together, we can see how much each lens changes the feeling of the story. The aspects we just discussed are all unique characteristics that produce a signature that, when mixed with the sensor and LUT, creates something totally unique, and I would say beautiful. But which one's better? Trick question. It's not about which one's better, rather which one matches your vision. When doing lens comparison tests, I think the only wrong answer is not doing a comparison at all. Let's do one more. In this daylight comparison, you can see how these lenses react differently than at night with strong light sources. The Primo perfectly controls the image with total clarity, but is not artificially sharp. As the focus comes close, the warm flare and lack of lens breathing is nearly perfect, and when we land on the close-up, relying solely on the light iron color LUT without additional color correction, this image speaks of power and intensity. When we switch to the Panaspeed, we immediately can feel a hue shift. In daylight, Panaspeed has a visible green bias, but this is useful because green actually aids in balancing out unwanted magenta, making skin tone look a little more natural. It has less glare, which makes it less stylized with less overall sharpness, which also makes it, I think, the perfect lens for numerous choices. The pupil flares, those little dots in the foreground, they give a subtle layer of color between the camera and the subject, which adds some style. And then we have the H Series. Wow, what a difference. The rear windows explode with halation, which invites a vintage, soft, and dreamy appearance. Yet even though the bloom is strong, the image remains sharp. There's a strong contrast, which you can see in the black frames of the windows, which don't disappear. High order aberrations give depth to the image by breaking up the light and producing a softer result on those highlights, almost like optical smoothing effects. You can see at the end of the shot, the image retains its tack sharpness, and yet at the same time blooms with natural smoothing agents. It's beautiful. And then the Ultra Vista, my favorite. This lens widens the field of view, but has very little geometric distortion for such a strong anamorphic image. The anamorphic characteristics are still producing fine details without appearing too contrasty, and they have distinct horizontal flares that are multicolored, bringing an intensity that I think give it a hint of a sci-fi look. Upon the close-up, this lens gives me the best sense of dimensionality. Flare characteristics in front of the subject and behind, like she's wrapped inside a multi-dimensional world of light. I absolutely love this look, and it's something totally unique to Panavision. Altogether, we can see how even in the same conditions, the optics alone dramatically change the texture and taste of the image. The foundational aspects of color, saturation, contrast, and texture are sealed within each lens, setting them apart from each other. While there's still a lot to be done with lighting and color correction, this is the last moment an image is actually analog, and it's why it's so important to consider the subliminal effects, because they will be permanently burned into every frame you shoot. Now, I realize we just examined what the best in the business use daily with professional camera rental packages, like the one from the company Panavision. But what does it all mean? Well, as I've mentioned in this series before, I used to work for Panavision, so that means I'm a fan. But I actually did these lens tests because I wanted to see for myself how much lens texture actually affects the image. Just like that kid mixing up flavors of soda, experimentation and evaluation are the roots of inspiration. Do you have a reaction to one lens over the other? If so, then you realize the role texture plays in how we tell stories, which is why it's so important that you're in control of your signature look, and you don't just leave it up to whatever generates the images you create. Which makes me think, I wonder what other lenses I could test in order to create a signature look.